All right, everyone's ready? Judges ready? Partner ready? All right, let's begin. We negate. Attention 1, poking the bear. Economic sanctions will only further provoke Russian aggression for 3 reasons. First, nationalism. Frank Cifullo of the International Economy explains that public discontent over sanctions have allowed Putin to harness political influence in Russia to reawaken Russian nationalism and create animosity towards the West. Indeed, Katie Simmons of Pew finds in 2015 that an all-time high of 81% of all Russians harbor hatred towards the West. This is problematic since Elena Lenin of the Journal of Political Risk finds that nationalism isolates political opinion and reduces the chances of behavioral modification intended by sanctions in the first place. Second, the oligarchs. Richard Connolly of the CRES finds that the longer sanctions persist, the more the market-oriented elite become marginalized. Under such sanctions with the elite in favor of greater military spending and state-led modernization will become emboldened at the expense of the liberal bloc. In fact, Donald Jensen of the Institute of Modern Russia explains that the rise of influence in the radical right constrains Putin's ability to cooperate, as they would resist any decision to strike a deal with the West over Ukraine. Pulling out of Donbass and Ukraine entirely might create a threat to the regime itself. Third, natural resources. Joseph Nye of Harvard explains that weakening countries are more risk-tolerant and more dangerous. A militarily strong but economically weak nation poses the greatest risk of resource-driven adventurism. Eric Lorber of Foreign Affairs explains that cut off from future Arctic development, and with 50% of its budget coming from natural resources, Russia is increasingly enticed by resources in eastern Ukraine and countries such as Kazakhstan that have substantial ethnic Russian populations and lots of oil. In fact, Crimea provided Russia with trillions of dollars in energy resources. But Russia's belligerence has already materialized. Emma Ashford of Cato finds that post-sanctions, the Kremlin's aggression only grew with the formal annexation of Crimea. In fact, James Miller of Radio Free Europe notes that the situation in eastern Ukraine is currently on the verge of open warfare. David Letskian of the American Journal of Political Science ultimately confirms the effect of sanctions on aggression, finding that sanctions increase the probability of conflict by 200%. Connection 2, the Middle East. Subpoint A, Iran. According to Dmitry Matsky of Foreign Affairs, sanctions crippled and inflation hit. Moscow sees weapon sales as economic opportunities in the Middle East in the years ahead. In response to sanctions, the Foreign Policy Initiative writes that Putin has moved rapidly to strengthen a Russian-Iranian partnership intended to weaken U.S. and Western influence. There are 2 negative impacts here. First, the Foreign Policy Initiative writes that the sale of the S-300 anti-aircraft missiles would embolden Tehran to project its power with relative impunity over Israel, over Saudi Arabia, and challenge all American allied aircraft in the region. Overall, Western interests are now in jeopardy in the Middle East. Second, the Iran nuclear deal is enforced by little more than trust and the threat of airstrikes, both of which are undermined by the sale of the missile system. As Karen Demirjian of the Washington Post finds, that S-300 missiles could effectively prevent a preemptive strike on Iran's nuclear program. And Sam Sorbayak of the American Thinker finds that the sale of weapons to Tehran effectively signals that Tehran is not keen on sticking with the deal. Subpoint B, Syria. Moises Naim of The Atlantic explains that Putin has increased his bombing campaign against ISIS as diplomatic leverage that can be deployed against sanctions, and that the fight for terms of engagement in Syria is likely to continue. The deployment of more Russian troops thus allows Putin to leverage the outcome of the Syrian war against the West. Russian militarization is already evident. The Guardian finds that Putin himself said that top Russian commanders would be joining those already fighting with Assad, just hours after a UN peace deal on Syria was struck. Lisa Haltman of Uppsala University empirically confirms this by finding that conflicts in which the government faces an imposed sanction have 82% higher intensity overall, and thus we negate.
Can I have my laptop?
Yeah, sure.
Can you just get it open once before rebuttal?
Yeah.
Okay.
Is everybody good? Can I get the first question?
Sure.
Okay. So in regard to your second contention on Iran, when we talk about the nuke deal, why would the sale of the S-300 missile, which isn't even capable of having nuclear effects, why would that undermine the nuclear?
Right, because it prevents the preemptive strike on their facilities, right? The reason why the Iran deal is so effective is because Israel or the U.S. can preemptively strike against Iran's facilities.
But S-300 missiles have been being exchanged for a while.
No. Iran has not possessed a single system of its nature until just recently.
Do you have evidence saying that?
I do. I can bring it up to you. Yeah. Can I have a question for you, if you don't mind?
Uh-huh.
So you mentioned this idea about how Russia's going to go into the Baltic states, and then NATO is going to come, and there's going to be a full-fledged war. In what world is that all rational? Why would NATO, again, go into the Baltic states and wage war with Russia?
So do you do you at least see the warrant that Russia would go into the Baltic states if they weren't prevented from doing.
I mean, here's the problem, right? Here's the problem.
Because we're just talking about that in the war.
Doesn't Putin recognize that NATO or the Baltic states are NATO allies, and doesn't he also know that NATO has a sworn defense agreement? So why would it be rational for Putin to engage directly with NATO?
We have very specific evidence from top Russian officials themselves saying that Putin is willing to test NATO and go as far as he's allowed to go. So unless sanctions are put in place or some kind of
why is he going to go that too far? So why is he willing to go that far?
Because he wants to restore Russian geopolitical dominance and restore the.
But again, here's the problem, right?
Yeah.
Prior to sanctions being applied, right? He only wanted Crimea. He only was interested in Crimea, and only after Crimea did he start to aggress further.
Why did he only want Crimea?
For its status as a warm water port and allowing his Russian ships.
Even if he wanted Crimea, there's no reason as to why he doesn't want to restore more areas of territorial.
Here's the problem. Sanctions have created a problem in Russia, right? They've diminished the economy significantly, which means Putin needs a geopolitical win, and that geopolitical win comes in the shape of Ukraine, comes in the shape of anywhere else in the world.
Actually, because his economy has fallen, remember, that's one of the warrants as to why we've brought him to the negotiating table, and you're seeing conflict in Ukraine, for example, go down by so much. Clearly, sanctions are working.
In what way has sanctions diminished his military capacity? And has his army been halved? In what way?
This is the beauty of our argument. Even if his military spending hasn't gone down at all, insofar as conflicts have gone down, that actually tells us that even if he has a really strong military, we're still seeing conflicts going down.
You're asking us to take a really big leap of faith. What's your link into the conflict reduction?
What?
You're asking us to take a really big leap of faith.
We're saying in Ukraine, after sanctions, even if there's still a lot of military, personnel there, because of things like the Minsk 2, they're literally not doing anything.
The Minsk 2 that had 300 violations in the first week after it was passed, right?
Well, either way, you're still seeing conflict go down, and you're seeing the lowest level of conflicts in sanctions.
We'll come back to the cards of our own, but
even if there's a couple violations
here and there, we have cards of our own to come at that. But yeah, questions for us? Yeah, go for it. Yeah.
So in terms of your first contention, when you talk about poking the bear, so I'm kind of confused on your oligarchs argument. Are you saying that the oligarchs depend on Putin? Is that what you were saying? It wasn't really.
We're saying that certain of them do, and those are the ones that are harmed. Certain of them do, and those are the ones that aren't harmed by sanctions.
Why do they depend on Putin? What does he have that they need?
He has the state-sponsored economy and the contracts that he gives out to them.
Okay. Do you want my laptop back before your phone?
Yeah, that'd be great. Yeah, sure. Thank you.
All right, we're going to start prep starting now.
Can I pause for a second? Where exactly is the cards again? I don't seem to see them.
Oh, sorry.
Yes.
Oh, you still need it.
Yeah.
Alright, so
They're okay, cool. Thank you.
alright, starting prep back up. So 1 minute. Can I have the token also?
Yeah.
Is everybody ready? So I'm just going to go straight down their face. Starting off with their first contention about poking the bear, let's go to their first warrant about increase in nationalism. They're telling you that because of sanctions, more Russians are having anti-American and anti-Western sentiments. Whether that is true or not, it's more important on what they want to act with the West. Henry Meyer of Bloomberg explains that since sanctions, as of last month, 75% of Russians want to have a better relationship with the West. This means despite the fact that they're angry with us, they still want these sanctions removed, and that is why they want better relations. This overall means that they don't want to actually act on these feelings, but rather come closer to remove the sanctions. Now let's move on to their second warrant, which is about harming the oligarchs and making them more radically right. First, you have to realize that these oligarchs are extremely angry because of the sanctions. Donald Jensen explains that because of the targeted nature of sanctions, they have lost 70% of the wealth. However, instead of blaming the United States and the West, they're blaming Putin for going into Crimea and are actually starting to oppose him. He explains further that this decrease in support for Putin because of their loss of wealth is a primary reason why they're currently seeking a new regime. This is a reason to vote affirmative because it's going to reduce the Western threats, as Foreign Affairs explains that the oligarchs will be guaranteed to put someone in who is less aggressive than Putin because they want someone who would be less aggressive and not have sanctions being put on in the future. Now let's go into their third warrant about searching for natural resources. First, this argument isn't applicable to a country like Russia. This is saying sanctions lead to more aggression when you cut a country off from their natural resources. But you have to realize, Russia is the largest oil producer in the world. This would happen if you cut someone off like Japan. In actuality, they're not losing their oil supplies because national interest explains that since sanctions, Russia has increased its relationship with India in order to get new oil equipment to continue drilling in the Arctic. In actuality, Interfax writes that since sanctions have been put in, oil production from Russia have gone up by 1.4% and have reached the historic high levels, meaning their oil production is higher than ever. There's no reason for increased aggression. Now let's go on to their impact. Their entire impact is this generic evidence looking at all sanctions, leading to an increase in aggression by 200%. But this is when you have comprehensive sanctions. In Russia, you have targeted sanctions that don't literally target the entire economy. In actuality, when you look at Russia-specific evidence, you see aggression going down. Remember what the UN said in case, that overall casualties in Ukraine are down by 232%. Prefer our evidence because it's Russia-specific. Now let's go on to their second contention, where they talk about how it increases their presence in the Middle East. This is actually not happening. National Interest explains that since sanctions were put in place, Russia has to work with the United States as a way to get the sanctions off and act on our good side. It's actually caused them to be less aggressive in the Middle East and actually start to benefit us. Now let's go on to their first subpoint about Iran. Literally, this entire argument has to do with selling the S-300 missile system. But what they don't realize is that according to International Business Times, Russia tried selling these weapons in 2007. However, because of U.S. sanctions on Russian businesses and on Iran, this sale was prevented. However, in 2015, those sanctions that prevented the sale were lifted, and that is the only reason they were sold. Meaning, before sanctions were preventing this threat, it's only because sanctions were lifted that this did not happen. Now, let's go on to their second impact on Iran, which is meaning that it decreases the nuclear deal. Their only impact coming off this is that we cannot strike Iran's nuclear facilities. But why would we strike Iran's nuclear facilities if sanctions in the status quo are preventing them from getting a weapon? It's better not to actually have to go to war and achieve an objective rather than to invade. If we were to strike Iran's nuclear facilities, there would be mass casualties because it would literally put hundreds of nuclear material into the sky. Now, their next subpoint has to do with Russia and Syria. But Kenneth Pollock of the Brookings Institute explains that Syria is not a U.S. or Western interest because they have no oil, they're not a democracy, or a major trade partner. But more importantly, they've actually signed a deal with the UN to be less aggressive and to work with us.
We'll take a little bit of prep time.
Yeah.
Awesome. Oh, thanks.
One second, Jasmine. I have to
Yeah, let me know. Oligarch, ready? Alright, start off with their first contention. First thing that they talk about is an alternative. Recognize first, you don't want to look at the alternatives if doing nothing would actually be better than sanctions. This is the Leskian analysis that we read in Case. A world with sanctions increases militarized conflict 200% compared to a world without. At that point, the world where we do nothing is better. But then second, recognize that it's just irrelevant to look at this because policy options are never done in isolation. It's not like I can just do sanctions or just invade a country. I can do both at the same time. It's not like we're looking at alternatives and weighing this debate. But then third and finally, if they want to talk about an alternative, one they never mention is a collective defense security guarantee. In fact, according to Kurt Volker of Foreign Policy, NATO has the option of issuing a collective defense security guarantee articulating the absolute commitment of the alliance to defend the territory of all NATO member states. In fact, according to Brett Leeds of Rice, these guarantees decrease the probability of conflict by 28%. Then on their second point, where they start talking about Ukraine and the conflict decreasing there. But first, recognize that the conflict is actually escalating. First, Nick Bruce finds of New York Times finds in mid-December, and remember, this postdates their October evidence saying that there was a 270% decrease in violence. They actually find that the number of civilians killed in the last 3 months have doubled when compared to the previous 3 months. Obviously, Putin is not trying to decrease the conflict in Ukraine if all he keeps doing is escalating it. But then second, recognize Iana Dreyer of the EU ISS finds that sanctions have caused Russia to step up its military engagement in the Donbass, even after these restrictive measures were passed. Obviously, he's just becoming more belligerent, not less. Then third and finally, recognize Simon Galbert of CSIS finds that there are still more than 12,000 Russian soldiers in eastern Ukraine. If he wanted to scale back the conflict, he wouldn't be deploying a standing military force there. Then recognize fourth, Russia is not even upholding its end of the ceasefire that it agreed to. In fact, there are over 300 violations just in the first week, according to Francis Coppola of Forbes. But what's most critical is that the Department of State, the EU Parliament finds that since the Minsk II ceasefire has been implemented, there have been waves of increased violence and the number of casualties is rising. Ultimately, that shows you that the conflict is escalating, not de-escalating. But then third and finally on this point, they start talking about the Baltic states. First, recognize that according to the Moscow Times, Russia would never launch any military action against the Baltics because they're NATO security guarantee defended. That means they never want to actually fight NATO because they know it's going to be a losing battle. But then second, according to Brian McDonald of the Evening Herald, there's no strategic importance of Baltic countries, unlike Crimea, which has trillions of dollars of energy resources. There's absolutely no incentive for Putin to be invading the Baltics when there's nothing there for him to gain. But then third and finally, according to Robert Person of Washington Post, Baltics are already part of NATO, so there's no use in him going in and trying to stop them from joining NATO like he did in Crimea. He didn't want Crimea to become more Western-facing. There's no threat of that in the Baltics. Then on their second contention, where they talk about Iranian proliferation. First, recognize that Iranian sanctions back when they were actually enforced were really ineffective. Remember, according to Susan Maloney of Brookings, she explains that Iran did not adjust its aspirations with respect to its nuclear program or its claims to regional power, and outright failed to achieve their intended policy results. There are two warrants to this. First, Nima Assi of The Guardian explains that Iraq actually made these sanctions against Iran ineffective because Iraq was actually supplying all of these nuclear materials to Iran. But second, according to Stephen Henke of Cato, he actually finds that when sanctions were in place, even conservative estimates found that Iran only needed at most 2 years before it had enough fissile nuclear material to construct a weapon. That only shows you that there was really no effectiveness of these Iranian sanctions back in the day when they were actually implemented. But then, most importantly, recognize that David Jonas of War on the Rocks, and this is the only present-day impact that is actually being read in this round in regards to Iranian sanctions, he finds that the Iran nuclear deal negotiated after sanctions will actually facilitate Iran's path to nuclear weapons and keep development of any nukes covert. The reason and warrant behind this is that when these Iranian sanctions were in place, it actually only propelled Iran's development of their nuclear weapons program, which now is giving Iran more leverage in terms of when they actually go and negotiate at the negotiating table. That means that the West actually has more to lose and Iran has less to lose, and that's why the terms of the Iran nuclear deal actually favor the development of a nuclear program, not halt it. All right, you have the first question.
Yeah, just 1, 2, 3. All right. So let's start off with your responses to how we have to look to an alternative. You say you can have a security guarantee and that reduces conflict, right?
Yeah.
What is the Budapest Memorandum?
I don't know, you tell me.
Well, the Budapest Memorandum is something that the West signed with Ukraine and said, if you give up nuclear weapons, we will guarantee your security from Russia. But Russia invaded despite the fact there was that security guarantee.
Okay, we'll actually look at that evidence afterwards, but the evidence that I actually read
okay.
says that there was no security guarantee against Ukraine, which was why he was
No,
so,
there was no
like,
NATO security guarantee.
Right,
But
okay, so
Budapest
that's what
was
we're saying.
specifically with the United States and the UK.
All right,
that
that's pretty
means
critical.
your like alternative literally does not work. And
I
not
mean,
to mention, the
our
entire
alternative-
reason why he invaded was because NATO
Right,
was
okay.
trying to create a security guarantee in the first place.
Our alternative does specifically specify NATO, and if that like memorandum happened without any NATO guarantee, right? Like then it's a different thing that we're
Okay.
talking about.
All
Can I
right.
actually ask you a question?
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, when you talk about oligarchs and you talk about how they lost 70% of their wealth,
Mhm.
now that now that they're unable to get contracts with the West, where are they getting the majority of their money from?
Well, they used to be getting it from Putin, but despite the fact that
They used to, so how about now?
Putin doesn't have like the money to give them. And more importantly,
Wait.
even with Putin giving them like a little bit of money that he can afford, they are still in the whole 70%.
So you're
That's
telling me
why
that the
they are
only
turning
wealth-
against him
Alright,
and
sure.
want sanctions removed
So you're
and want a leader
okay,
who will act
but ultimately,
calmly.
at the end of the day, these oligarchs can now only get their wealth from Putin, correct?
Or they can get rid of him and get sanctions lifted.
I mean,
That's
is
a
there-
much better alternative
I mean,
instead of
have
giving
you been-
small amounts of money or all of their wealth.
Has any oligarch actually come out and said, I'm going to, I disagree with Putin?
Yeah, like the majority of them come out and said, yeah, we're thinking about getting rid of him. Yeah.
They did? Then how are they still getting like these contracts and this power from Putin?
Because they literally just came out and said it in like November.
Wait, no, that's not true. Like, there's no like single person who has ever come out and said, I'm
Really?
against
What did
Putin.
Kor-
That's part of the
What
oligarchs.
did
And the reason is
Khodorkovsky
very clear.
What did Khodorkovsky do in on December 11th?
Well, I
He
mean,
came
I
out
would
and said
argue that
he
that's
hated
actually
Putin
different.
and wished Putin would get taken out by the rest of the
Yeah,
oligarchs.
so I would actually
That
argue
is
that
what
that's
happened.
so I would
Now,
argue
may I
that's
ask-
different. Well, that's different because Putin actually
Okay.
arrested him,
Okay,
and that's
may I-
the exact point that we're making.
may
He's
I-
actually closing up his circle, and now there's just more people who are
Okay.
from the radical right that are among his circle of
Jasmine,
power.
may I ask you a
But
question?
yeah, go ahead.
All right. So in response to our evidence that says conflict has decreased by 232%,
Mhm.
you say actually casualties went up double, right?
Right. So your
So
evidence
what-
comes from mid-October.
No, our analysis comes from the UN as of December 20th.
No,
However,
but the
your-
data is the last data comes
No,
from October.
no,
I mean,
the
we called for the card.
no.
We looked at it. We can.
I
find it
know,
out.
but I have your card, and the last point of data that your evidence analyzes is August.
Wait, that's
It-
actually not true. I
Yes,
can like
it
show you.
come-
I can show
no,
you the evidence.
Your card is dated in December, but
No.
it's quoting a UN study that looked at conflict and ended in August.
All right, I mean,
so my
I can-
question
I
is,
can actually show
why
you the
should we
data
be
set
looking
for
at
it.
what happened previously when in the status quo conflict is decreasing?
Well, I mean, first of all, right, Samantha Power tells you Russia has this like pattern. They make a lot of compromises and they make a lot of deals, like they pretend to make a lot of deals, and then they backtrack right back on it. So like in the end of the day, like if that just continues happening, if this cycle just continues where he's making this agreement but then just turns his back and continues to do the same thing, then I would argue there's no real progress being made.
Okay. We're gonna. Oh, hold on. Before we start, could we see a couple pieces of evidence? First, the war on the rocks analysis you read against our Iran contention,
Mm-hmm, sure.
and then second, the one about Iraq providing nuclear material to Iran.
Yeah.
No, Iran, right? Yes. Oh, and could we see your evidence about casualties going up by double?
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's the thing.
Hey, Bruce.
Alright, so this is the Iraq sanctions against Iran.
Do you have like just them carded?
I don't have this one.
Can you at least highlight like?
Okay,
where
yeah,
you guys-
sure. So this is the Iraq card, and then these are the cards we asked for. This one is the war in the rocks, and this is the thing.
Okay. Starting now.
Hold on, actually, can we pause back? Is this last card right here the one you're saying casualties?
Yeah.
The one from September, right? Like
Yeah.
this? Okay.
Yeah.
Hold on, can we pause again? Where's the evidence about Iraq?
It's in the PDF.
It's the PDF, yeah.
Oh,
Yeah, let's
Just
just
trans
command
out.
tab.
oh, okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's the highlight portion, yeah.
I'm technologically
Yeah,
related.
no worries.
Alright, 6 seconds left. You can take that.
Here, guys. Go. Is everybody good? Alright. So the first voting issue you're going to look at is alternatives. Remember that we say that sanctions are the best option because they deter belligerent actors like Putin and actually allow for positive negotiation. Their only response is that in a world with sanctions, there is a 200% increase in military conflict. This piece of evidence isn't specific to Russia. Make them prove uniqueness, especially since we're giving really specific evidence. But then they say the NATO security agreements work. Remember that Putin was willing to test NATO and go into the Baltics because of that because of like the notion of them joining NATO in the first place. So obviously the security agreement is like is actually helping Russia more than anything. But also remember that we have very specific evidence saying Putin is willing to resolve or like test NATO's resolve, so it's not really a factor. Now let's also evaluate that sanctions have brought Putin to the negotiating table, and more specifically, Minsk II, the ceasefire signed in Ukraine, actually decreased overall conflict by 232%. They say they post data, so when we ask for their evidence, it's actually from September, and ours is actually from mid-December, and the evidence that we it cites from is also more recent, so you can give that to us. And they also say that there's more troops, and there's been 300 violations since the ceasefire. Insofar as you're still seeing overall conflict decreasing, clearly more like troops on the ground doesn't matter insofar as the ceasefire is working and sanctions have brought more peace. You can literally vote first right here because this is the easiest way to like connect to Western interests. So the second voting issue is going to be the effects of proliferation. Now all they say is really that the Iranian sanctions were effective 2 years ago. That doesn't change the fact that we have specific evidence from BBC saying that like Iran still wants nuclear weapons, and the only reason why they're not getting them was coming from Putin himself is because of sanctions that were imposed that might be lifted in March. And as soon as those sanctions are lifted, they get those nuclear weapons. Now they say that they're going to get them in 2 years anyways, but insofar as sanctions aren't letting them get it now, you're still seeing this increased impact. But also they talk about fissile material from Iraq, but insofar as that's not even nuclear when we ask for the evidence, you can discount that as well. But the problem is when sanctions are lifted, Iran getting nuclear materials is bad for the West in 2 reasons. First of all, the global economy, because of the speculation of oil shocks, will be really bad, and it's going to decrease GDP by 8%. But also remember that Iran having nuclear weapons is really bad because it's going to increase interstate conflict.
right, opponents ready?
Yeah.
I got this thing once again.
Before you start, how much
Alright.
do you have left?
Yeah, we can start time.
How much pets?
We have 25 left.
25. Oh, 1 second. Just put that in my.
Alright, so 2 observations and then 3 main voting issues. Alright, everyone ready? Recognizing that opponent's entire offense is predicated on the short term, but for the long term for one really important reason. Russia's entire aggressive strategy will last far in the long term unless if we continue to poke and prod them. That's why it's really important to look to the long term in today's round. I'll prove that to you in 3 ways. First, and the second observation is really important as well. Recognize onto the first mention talking to you about how that's the best option, and they tell you that, well, Russia's willing to test NATO, and that's the way they respond to the 28% reduction card, but that's problematic because they dropped the other 3 responses we give to the Baltic states, Moscow Times, the Evening Herald, all which show that the Russia will simply not be willing to test the NATO in that regard because they know they'll lose. At that point, extend that response, their entire first condition drops right there. Now it's time our voting issues onto the long term. First, nationalism. They say that we want better relationships with the West, but the Levada Center says that most of them actually don't want to capitulate. So even though they may want some theoretical great thing, they're not willing to capitulate on their values. That means you extend to the impacts of the behavior modification going clean drop. At that point, in the long term, again, we have no ability to make Russia concede to our goals and make them more hard lines and more antagonistic. Down to oligarchs, they say overall we lose 7% of their wealth, but that's the point. The market-oriented elite are getting cut out of the circle, and the radical right are getting in, and that means we see more hardliners and more aggressive stances, and that's why it's important. They say that, well, there'll be a regime change, but the problem is Putin controls all the purse strings. He controls the contracts, and that's why they'll be more powerful. The radical right will push them to further. Then onto natural resources. He says they're not losing the oil price. Oil production is rising. Oil production, but not oil sales. The sales is going down, and that means he needs more resources, which will lead to more incursions and more adventures in the future. Outweigh on time from there, and we went on more aggressions there. Then last but not least, onto Iran. Now he specifically says overall there's more cooperation, etc., and that these missile systems weren't relevant. But the problem is this: they were just delivered in December. And the reason why they're really important is that the Iran nuclear deal cannot be enforced without the threat of airstrikes. That means in the long term, if Iran decides to break the deal, we can't stop them. We have a nuclear Iran, and you can turn every single one of their impacts they read to off of second contention onto our side, because that's a problem in the long term. And that's why I strongly urge a negative ballot.
All right. Everybody ready?
Yes.
So let's go to the impact you're talking about on your Iran subpoint. You're saying that because they have the S-300 missile system, we can't attack their nuclear facilities, right?
Mm-hmm. Right.
So, first, you're saying that they shouldn't have a bomb, but second, wouldn't it just be better just to, make it hard for them to get a bomb than to actually attack and create, a mushroom cloud when you blow material?
Sure, here's the problem. Even when you do talk about sanctions making it harder for them, we read you specific evidence that tells you sanctions never actually made it harder for Iran to get these nuclear weapons. In fact, it just decreased the kind of security checks that the West was conducting on Iran.
When we read your evidence, it says 2 specific things. It says, one, it doesn't say that they, stopped. It doesn't say that. All it says is that they still had the intent to get nuclear weapons.
The ability, they were still producing on track.
No, they weren't producing the fissile material capable of a nuclear weapon. Our evidence is very specific, saying that they can't develop the weapon without that, and the only reason they don't have it now is because Russia couldn't provide it because of sanctions.
No, Nick, remember the Cato evidence that tells you there was no difference when sanctions were in place, and even conservative estimates put it at only, at most 2 years before they would get.
And if we're going to look at 2 years as a benefit, if we're going to look at 2 years as a benefit, right, look to the long term. Iran is a nuclear threat in the Middle East is a problem as per your own case. Yeah. 2 years is insignificant in the long term.
Okay, first, we show you they were close to getting a nuclear bomb before sanctions, but sanctions were in place for 10 years, and they never developed a nuclear weapon because they couldn't get the actual material. You might have the technology, but if you don't have the actual material to go in the machine, it doesn't work.
The only obstacle.
No, you're extending through a lot of ink at that point. That was specifically telling you both.
Your cards are literally horrible. Where you're saying Iraq's providing material, all it does is talk about trading goods.
No. Iraq is not providing material. Iraq is providing the means to get around sanctions economically. That's what we say. You're just misframing our card and saying, well, we responded to the misframed version of it. That's not what our card is saying. Let's move on.
But more importantly, when you do talk about the present tense, right, you never respond to the Iran nuclear deal evidence that tells you because it was so ineffective, these sanctions actually led to less negotiating power of the West, which means that they had to actually capitulate onto terms that they weren't actually willing to capitulate on, which means they had less power in terms of deciding the terms of that agreement.
So let's talk about Ukraine real quick, right? So Ukraine, you talk a lot about how this idea that, conflict's dropping right now, right? Yeah. But isn't historically, Putin especially in particular, Isn't he keen on stop and go policies in order to go to the West and then leave again and go to the West again? And isn't the deployment of 12,000 Russian troops an indication of his true motives?
Those troops aren't doing anything.
But they're in
because
Ukraine.
of that,
Why are they just
ceasefire.
sitting in Ukraine?
That has nothing to do with sanctions.
Wait,
Wouldn't it
no,
be
no,
more
no,
likely the fact
wait.
that he put troops there because the West put like 50,000 troops on the other side of the border? Maybe he's just trying to protect himself.
No. Your job in this debate, right, is to prove a reduction of threat. If Russia has lost 12,000 troops on the ground and there are 300 violations in the
But
first
if
week
you're
after,
still-
one sec, 300 violations in the first week afterwards, you're not proving a reduction in
If you're
threat.
seeing that despite like those number of troops being in the border, you're still seeing like an overall reduction in like casualties.
Right,
you're
sure.
seeing that those troops don't
Fine.
matter.
Wait, ultimately, here's our point in the round. Like, there have been increases and decreases in violence, like, over, like, 1 month
Past 2
period
years, right,
for
yeah.
the past 2 years. That's not the most important thing to look to, because that really doesn't determine much about their policy in the future.
Okay.
Yeah. All right. We have 7 seconds starting now. All right. Got that. All right, is everybody ready? All right, so before I start, I'm going to go over a comparison on which type of impacts to prefer, then go into their case, and then go back into our voters. Okay. In the last speech, the con wants you to prefer long-term impacts, but they literally never warrant this. The resolution is naturally in the present tense, talking about what is happening now, meaning that a short-term impact is all we have to prove to meet the resolution. So if we meet that goal, that is enough for you to affirm. So now let's go into the voting issues that the con extends in the last speech. First, they extend all their warrants on their first contention, but they don't explain why the impact matters. All they're getting is a 200% increase in aggression. But remember, we show you that this evidence is literally not specific to Russia. It looks at comprehensive sanctions. But targeted sanctions are what are used on Russia. And we show you in the status quo that because of these targeted sanctions, conflict is at its lowest level it's ever been in Ukraine. That's empirical proof that there's less aggression. Their second thing they extend is this S-300 missile argument on Iran. But they never respond to the argument saying that in 2007 they tried to sell these missiles, but because of sanctions, they weren't sold. They only were sold in December because those sanctions on Iran were actually lifted. So now let's go into the reasons you should be voting affirmative. The first one is on Ukraine. They're saying that overall conflict has increased. But remember, their analysis is outdated when compared to ours. Ours very specifically says that casualties are down 232% since sanctions were put on place, and you have the lowest level of conflict. They say we still need to look to the future, but at the point where we show you in case, and they literally never respond, that if sanctions weren't put on, Putin would have gone and taken more of Ukraine, including Kiev. That is empirical proof that he did not have more aggression and stopped because of sanctions. The second reason you should be voting for us is on Iran. All they're saying is that sanctions were not effective, but they still were effective because in the status quo, they were unable to get a nuclear weapon because they did not gain this fissile material. We give you 2 warrants that the sanctions on Iran and the sanctions on Russia prevented this trade, and if there weren't sanctions, they would have this bomb. They agree this is a horrible threat because it increases regional aggression and harms the U.S. economy. And we show you very specifically, instead of them having a bomb in 2 years, they would have had a bomb 10 years ago if these sanctions were never put on place.
remember the observation that Abhi put at the top of summary. He tells you that the long term is more important. This is really critical because we've been extending this card throughout the round from Samantha Power, who tells you that Russia makes many commitments in the short term, then turns its back on them, and has stop-and-go violence policies where they will increase violence in the short term but then decrease it again. That's really critical because any temporary decrease in violence is not enough to show a reduction in threat. They need to do the warrant analysis to show you why in the long term it no longer has the intention to be an aggressive, belligerent country. With that, move on to the first voter issue in today's round, which is on aggression. We give you multiple impacts or warrants to this that they never respond to. First, on nationalism. We tell you that specifically it isolates the people of Russia from the West, and they're less likely to negotiate, and the West has less leverage over them in the future. Outweigh this on time frame because even if it solves the current conflict right now, in every future conflict, the West is going to have no power to decide what happens in Russia because those people are no longer going to listen to the voices of people. Remember, Lenin specifically cards this and tells you that there is no, that it decreases the chance of behavior modification. But then second, on oligarchs. Remember, we tell you, they specifically tell you that it isolates the market-oriented liberal elites. That's what we're telling you. The only people who are left right now within the inner circle of Putin's advisors are those people who are on the radical right. That's going to only increase and encourage further aggression. But then third and finally, on natural resources that they completely don't respond to. Remember, we tell you, because his GDP and his revenue is decreasing, he's now looking to future aggression in Kazakhstan, in Crimea, and formally annexing it in order to get these energy resources he wants. We give you 3 specific impacts in Ukraine. First, we tell you that the belligerence has increased, the aggression has increased on net since the beginning of the Ukrainian conflict, from the beginning of 2016 from Ashford in case. Then we tell you Ukraine is on the verge of open warfare. They never respond to that. And then finally, remember, there's a 200% empirical conflict increase in probability. That's a very critical way that we're linking in and winning this argument. But more importantly, on Iran. Remember, first of all, they don't even give you any kind of impact analysis. They never give you the chance that Iran is actually going to launch these nuclear weapons against the United States. Remember, of mutually assured destruction. That's just simply not any kind of impact analysis they're giving you. But more importantly, we tell you sanctions actually increase the likelihood that they would get a nuclear weapon.
It was a 2-1 for the affirmative.
So, I squirreled, so I guess I'll say why. So when I just look down this flow, specifically on the app, I don't see a lot of offense coming off of just saying that sanctions are the best option we have right now. That's a super defensive point, and it's one that I just don't really jive with. And like, I'd much rather see a point saying like you sort of talked about how like military intervention is extremely costly. I would much rather, like, I would have probably voted on for you if you instead run a point like any other alternative in the world right now, it's far worse. Instead of just saying sanctions are better, by pointing out the clear and definitive detractors to taking a more forceful action would garner you a lot more offense than that point did.
That makes actually a lot of sense.
And so when we look to Iran, my big thing with Iran was on your side. Like, pretty much so, you both agree in like this fiated world, eventually Iran has the capabilities to get a nuclear weapon. But the thing that I sort of like that they bring up is previous to the Iran deal, Iran was doing it completely covertly. And so in that world where like these sanctions made Iran go and hide these things, by saying by opening up the books within this, they're adding at least a modicum of basic transparency. No matter how weak the Iran deal may seem, like that is still a better world where in which we can at least see some part of what Iran is doing rather than just being blacked out completely. I'm gonna go to my RFD to get the rest of this. Let's see what else. Okay. Also, and the other thing is because she goes faster, and so for me, she just was able to get in her speeches a lot more on the flow, which, like, for me, it sort of made siding with them a lot easier because I saw a lot more coming from their side, like just covering a lot more than you could because you are more traditionally styled in public forum. And so for me, that just sort of hurt you because just the sheer amount that I could see coming from them, like,
Alright,
pushed them over a bit.
That makes sense.
I'll just go down there for a little bit. So you talk about when you're blocking their nationalism, you're like saying like we have to look at actions over like this like sentiment of like just because they feel bad. And at that point, that's fine. But when we look to the fact that like they clearly bring up no one wants to capitulate, then like it doesn't matter. And so forward to when you're talking about oligarchs, you're saying like oligarchs are really mad, like these sanctions suck, and they're trying to like create this regime change. But like they blocked it pretty easily, saying like, yeah, and you know what? One of the oligarchs that complained about it just got arrested. That's basically silencing any further dissent that a moderate could bring. And then also, it's very hard to like just say like, because the oligarchs, the wealthy are mad that these things are going to happen, because Putin is basically has all the tentacles for the Russian Federation government. Like he can control if they make any money. And so at that point, like they sort of just push over, and like the defense that they bring and like trying to extend just wins over.
So I kind of focused more like, because you said they mentioned like they got a lot out, but I felt like what you said was a little bit more quality, I guess to say. Like they even mentioned like one of their arguments, or states that like because you didn't answer 3 of the pieces of their evidence, so that's why I shouldn't. But I was like okay, like sure they didn't answer to it, but they had one really good argument against it. So that's why I kind of felt that it was important to realize. I actually like the fact that like with the nationalism idea, it's just like, because they didn't really answer to the fact that like 75% of residents are that's 5% relations. They didn't really answer for that too much. And so I think but you also didn't stress it too much at the end either. So I felt if you stressed a little bit more, it's kind of like me like realizing like this was important, but it was dropped on both sides. But I felt that it should be carried through. And then going on to the oligarchs, for me it was kind of interesting. They made a good argument regarding someone new can come into power, but you didn't really give me any a potential, any real warrants behind it. Like you just said some right-wing individual is going to take over, to be even potentially worse than Putin. And I was like, sure, you can say that, but you don't have any warrants to back it up for me. So I didn't really it was hard for me to do this. So I was focusing more they're going to overthrow Putin because he's too aggressive. And so that's why they don't want to have Putin in power anymore. So that's why I kind of went with the pro on that oligarchs argument. And then for the oil, what I understood in the original on the con about natural resources is adventuralism. The whole idea you're going out there. You didn't really talk too much about sales. You talked about how they're not able to harvest these resources anymore. And then but they answered oil production is going up because they got all this equipment from India. And you never answered that. So I felt and then you mentioned later on it was it's actually but this is talking about production, not sales. And I was what does sales have to do with it anymore? The production's obviously going to increase because they're trading with India, which is not part of the sanctions. So there you go. And going into the idea with Iran, the international the whole idea of the sanctions being implemented before and then those being lifted is why they're selling the rockets. That really or the missiles. That's really sold it for me. Was I understand you have the potential increased time for it to happen, but still your point. What did I put on here? Yeah, because let's think the old ones, not because these new ones being put that you tried to sell. They've clearly stayed with more. They had more recent evidence, so I was able to buy it a little bit more so than previously. If this debate happened 2 months ago, you'd be able to go with that. All the arguments you did and evidence you had would have been perfect. But the thing is, they brought in the more recent stuff and point out that this is what was wrong with the evidence, and this is why you should prefer our evidence. And to me, that really sold it for me, because I like the idea they're pointing out here's what I should put down, here's what I need to write, here's what I need to look at. So it's a little bit helpful for me to kind of guide it. So they just kind of did a little bit better job of that, so I was able to vote for them.
Just expanding on some of the ideas that he just mentioned, one of the things that I thought your arguments might seemed a little bit more theoretical than actual solidified. For example, the same thing with potentially having a more volatile leader come into play. I mean, we just don't know that. And so that's what I felt. In terms of the 300 violations, maybe I wanted to have some expansion on that, because I didn't see, even though he's continuing to violate these things, I didn't see it as how that made it ineffective. So hopefully that makes sense. And where I felt like when you were talking about, you were giving numbers in terms of decreases in casualties, to me that showed solidified evidence that they were effective. So
Thank you.
Thank you.